Now, remember that we are doing this as a series. This is the first meetup in a series of 9 meetups. What we're going to do is, so today's overview, okay, try to see what, give me just a second, let me mute this person. Try to understand what Carl Jung has done. I mean, personally, I mean, he's a person where no matter when I go back to him and on what topic, there is a richness I find. So I have this feeling that there is this ocean, and I have been kind of wading at the edge of it, but there is a lot more to be explored. So he's a very rich thinker. So try to get appreciation of the breadth of his thought. And secondly, this idea that he has of individuation is a very powerful idea. Try to understand the value of it. What we are going to do is that, sorry about the interruption. There was a technical stuff. I want to make sure everything is working. Okay. So secondly, understand the concept of individuation. We will come back to this concept again and again from various different angles. I have put together a simplified diagram. I'm a very visual person. So I've put together the 4 different elements and 4 different interactions that I see operative. And we will take each of those things and we'll be talking about individuation in the light of shadow, individuation and persona. We'll be talking about individuation and archetypes in detail in future meetups. Today is an overview. So that's an introduction. And with that, I'm going to have each person talk, each of them. So let's see, Paul, would you like to go first? So 2 questions for each person. First question, why Jung? Talk a little bit about your interest in Jung and why you're fascinated with Jung. And second, talk about the concept of individuation that Jung has. Paul.
You would like me to answer both questions at the same time here?
Yes.
Okay. Hello, everybody. My name is Dr. Paul Jenkins. I'm a clinical psychologist. I work and practice in Sacramento, California. So it was a long trip for me to get here today. In regard to the first question, I want to tell this in a personal way. I was in college and I wasn't even sure what my major was going to be. I ended up taking this course called the Freudian Revolution, which was absolutely fascinating. It was taught by somebody from the psychology department and somebody from the history department, and explored Freudian theory along with all of the historical sociological ramifications of those ideas. So great course. And it was really quite impactful. And I felt like I had a really solid understanding of the human psyche and interaction with the larger world. And then a few weeks after I finished that course, Joseph Campbell started his video series that I saw on PBS in his interviews. And of course, Joseph Campbell was very strongly influenced by Carl Jung. And that brought me to end up reading Jung directly. But for me, the main impact as I was watching those interviews was how much wider the perspective was. I felt like Freud had said so many really powerful, important things about the individual psyche and individual development. And then it sort of, the view was about here. And then as I was listening to Joseph Campbell talk about myth and the themes of human nature, human society for millennia, the perspective went out to here. It felt like Jung was re-legitimizing a spiritual approach to human life and allowing for a much greater depth to the human psyche than was available through Freud's ideas. I want to dovetail that a little bit into the second question about individuation. Because as I read a great deal of Freud, it was very focused on individual development, and it's very focused on dynamics of conflict, of the self against the self against the other, the self against society, and really eventually the self against life at a certain level. As I shifted to read more of Jung, those dynamics began to shift with them. And I began to see things more as the self in relation to the self in relation to others, the self in relation to society, and eventually, at the widest sense, the self in relation to our existence in this universe. So it began to give texture, vision, tone, and understanding of those relationships. Another word for that is archetype. To me, archetypes are about the imagery, the conceptualization of my relationship to parts of myself and also parts of other and the world in the widest possible picture. So to me, individuation is about that process of deepening and enriching my knowledge of self, and by extension, my knowledge of other. And not knowledge just in the sense of academic information, but knowledge in terms of increasing the capacity for connection. It's about shared meaning, shared experience. And because a lot of, after I did some individual study of Jung, I went to a master's program that focused on Jung. It became a more collective experience because I was with a whole group of fellow students for 2 years who were all exploring these same things. And then, getting together after class and drinking wine and sharing more about it. So it became a collective identity. So individuation to me is about that journey of deeper self-discovery. And let me say one last thing. I work a lot. I've worked a lot over the years with young people, with adolescents, and it really brought home to me the idea of life as a developmental journey. And as we know, Jung, I don't want to overstate this, I don't want to oversimplify it, but Jung was largely interested in the struggle, the challenges and opportunities of the second half of life. So part of my vision of this is when Jung is talking about leaving behind or transcending the persona in order to become more individuated and develop more of one's individual personality, I think he was thinking along the lines of that lifelong journey where a big part of the first half of life is about developing an actually effective and adaptive persona, and then being able to transcend that into a healthy, separate, individuated personality. So I see it within individuation, within that larger lifetime psychological developmental process. So for a healthy individuation, you actually need to have a healthy persona to transcend, right? So that's so I kind of think of it in those terms when I'm working with people, sort of where are you in your process? For some people, I want to help them develop a healthier persona before they work towards, a healthier personality. But a lot of people are ready for that second part of the journey.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Paul.
Yeah.
Richard, you're next.
Hi there. Thanks for having me here. I'm from the UK. I'm Richard Owen, and I got into Carl Jung through originally typology. MBTI really was what started it off, and turns out MBTI is kind of a gateway drug to Jung, and it gets you into the hard stuff. So there I was, you know, like I know it's about the age 30 at the time, and yeah, you know, I've been living most of my life following, doing a degree in chemistry, having a career in music, a young INTJ at the time, wondering who he was in the world, and along came a bit of an answer, and suddenly made sense of a lot of who I was and why I was a little bit different to a lot of people out there who I tended to meet in the world, and ultimately got me into to discover really what introverted intuition is, and that's my type. I'm an introverted intuitive in typology terms. You know, what that experience is, what that window on reality is, that is introverted intuition that I experience, you know, innately and in depth. So it really put me in touch with that sense of who I was, and for that I'm forever grateful. And it led me into really studying it and taking it more seriously as a career, becoming an organizational psychologist, and just really studying personality, coming across the work of John Beebe, who's a great guy who writes quite deeply on converging the sort of typology back with the depth side. And you know, getting to know him and his work was you know, enlightening. I became a trustee for the British Association for Psychological Type. We run conferences here in the UK. We get people from all over the world talking about the subject, and it's really great to get into the depth side of it, because it can be done badly, it can be done superficially, but there's so much more to it once you really start looking into it, and it integrates fully into Jung's wider psychodynamic model, or his perspective on the psychodynamic model. So to take it typology outside of that context really doesn't do it any favors or any justice. And I think we need to understand fundamentally what the things he was talking about are a lived experiential model of reality through the mind as we live it. And that's why Jung for me, because unlike a lot of modern day psychology, he gives value to subjective experience. You know, he gives value to what it is to experience psychology as a subject, as the person. And that's why psychology is so unique, because the object is the subject to some degree. You know, that's why it's special amongst all of sciences. And we shouldn't like discard the value of subjective, introspective, phenomenological experience, which is why I like Jung, because it gives value to that, something which has been lost along the way in a lot of psychology. In terms of individuation, you know, I see typology as being really part of that. You know, we become one-sided, we become divided, and it's part of our course as human beings. That's how we develop, and we become one-sided. One aspect of the psyche becomes polarized, it becomes more central, it orientates our consciousness without us even realizing it's happening. And you know, the rest of life is trying to come to terms with that, and ultimately to transcend it. You know, this transcendence of reconciling opposites, and typology gives a language to what those opposites are that you can transcend. I think it's interesting. One of the questions I'll throw out to the panel that you might want to ask yourselves is, if Jung talks about individual and collective, so part of individuation is becoming an individual and not collective. So there's something a stage before individuation that is collective, and that is typology to some degree, that becoming, but on one level typology is individual because it makes you distinct and different to other people in the collective, or most similar to some other people of a similar type, but different to the collective. So I always question this, you know, on what level is being a type collective and not individual, because it kind of makes you an individual, but it's not individual on the level that Jung meant by individuation. By individual, he's saying there's nothing special about being a type, because everyone's kind of a type, so on a certain level. So actually, to become an individual, you have to become individual in a different way. That is one of the few people, and it's hard to meet anybody who's actually individuated, really. You know, in typological terms, if you talk to people and you go, well, what does being transcending thinking and feeling function? What does that actually look like? You know, what is this thinky, feely thing that is neither one nor the other, but it's greater than the sum of its parts? In practical life, you give me an example of making a decision. What does that actually look like? And I don't remember anyone that can really tell you what that actually looks like. So individuation ever really achieved fully, I don't know.
So Richard, that's a very good idea. So we'll put that as your question for the panel. And so what we'll do is that, so this, I love this. So when you're making your initial statement, please include one question that you would like to ask the panel. And then we will come to those questions for the panel later on. So Richard has already put his question. Paul, you did not get a chance to put the question, so you will get a chance to put in the question last. So the next person up is Skip. Skip, go ahead.
Okay, so I held by the nose by my anima. I was teaching in the University of Maryland Graduate School, and one of my colleagues was a beautiful woman, and I was enjoying having lunches with her, and she was a psychology professor. And so she starts to talk about Myers-Briggs, and I was pretty dumb at that time. So it took her, or maybe I just wanted to have a lot of lunches with her, because for 2 weeks, every day at lunch, she was trying to explain to me the Myers-Briggs. And so finally I grokked it. And then in 1990, I happened upon a copy of Man and His Symbols in a bookstore, and I bought it, brought it home. And for the next year, I read 3 or 4 pages of it, the hardbound version, with the good color prints in it, every night to my wife, read it out loud to her as we went to sleep. And after a year, we both thought we had had a year of psychotherapy. So then in 1992 or 3, my mother gave my wife Women Who Run with the Wolves by Clarissa Pinkola Estes. And Dr. Estes has a story in there starting on page 74 of the hardbound version called Vasilisa the Wise. And at the end of that story, she gave the 9 steps that a woman goes through to develop her intuition. And so I read that, and then I was thinking about writing a novel. And so I thought, well, maybe I could write a novel based on that series of steps. And my novel was a Japanese woman, her development from age 15 to age 75, who becomes the first woman prime minister of Japan. And after I typed on that for a couple of days, I was possessed by an archetype. And for the next 8 months, I had visioning like Dr. Jung had in the Red Book, and I could not stop the process. And I had to type out every word. It wasn't over until it was finished. And I had played through the archetype entirely. But I didn't know that then. And unlike Dr. Jung, I didn't have the benefit of any psychological training per se. And so I sort of left that aside. But then over the years, as I read more and more Jung, I found that he became my psychotherapist. And I had no experience, and still don't. I never have taken a psychology course and so on. But when the Red Book came out, I said, oh, wait a minute, that's what happened back there when I ended up writing that book. And the book is called Mako, Memoirs of a Woman. So it's the autobiography of my anima from age 15, from 1961 to 1993. And I realized that in retrospect. But I said to myself when the Red Book came out, well, maybe I wasn't crazy then, because this happened to the leading psychologists of the 20th century, so I'm not crazy. So meanwhile, I've been doing quite a lot more. And in 2010, then I started the archetypeinaction.com website, and in 2016, the Carl Jung Depth Psychology Reading Group, which is on YouTube and has over 1,000 videos at this point, all put there by me. So that's why Jung, in a nutshell. As far as individuation, back in the early 90s, I met a man who was a retired Army colonel, and he had served as the commander of Delta Force in the Army. And by that, I don't mean Delta Force, the hard-charging special operators. I mean Delta as in change force. And he was Jungian trained, and he developed the motto, "Be all you can be." That's an Army motto that was used for a long time in advertising, "Be all you can be." And so if we think of all living creatures know how to become that living creature. Okay, so every creature coming up from a gnat to an oak tree and a human being all know how to become what they're intended to become, except human beings, because human beings have one feature the others don't have, and that's consciousness. And so when consciousness gets put into the mix, then we have all these different ideas about what a human being should be, and those emerged as the major religions, among other things. And so an oak tree knows how to become an oak tree, and every oak tree meets certain characteristics, but every oak tree is different, and that's the same of all living creatures. In human beings, however, in order to achieve wholeness, which is this life force coming through you, you get launched into this chaos of human differentiation of all the different things, discernment. And we have to work out where we fit in that. And so individuation is about learning to understand what you were intended to be at any given time. And that can change over time, and it is changed by circumstances in various ways. So that, when I was 20, I joined the US Marines, and what I was going to be was a Marine Corps officer. Gung-ho, right? And so various things were involved in that. But after 23 years, guy came down and made me fall on the ice at Marine Corps Base Quantico, and I broke my leg. So I was finished with my Marine Corps career. And I was still evolving in very many different ways, but I had to then figure out, it's like an oak tree that has to find its way around a pipe. It has to find the light, right? And so you have to learn to see what your psyche wants you to become. And that's a question of looking within. And so the process of doing that, given your circumstances and your religion and what have you, is individuation. I'll leave it at that for now. I mean, I've done a lot of lectures on this.
Sure.
Elsewhere.
Wonderful. Skip, do you have a question for the panel that you want to, or you can think about it, and when I'll come back to you with a question. So each panelist gets to ask a question to the panel. So I'll come back to you if you don't have.
Okay.
Okay. Next up is Mikhail. Mikhail, go ahead.
Yeah,
you need to
I needed to unmute myself.
Yes, go ahead.
Well, welcome. Hello to everybody. My name is Michiel. I'm a mental health therapist with an orientation towards Jungian therapy and dream work. And based on a nighttime dream, I founded the Jung platform as another part of my vocational activities. Jung has a deep personal relevance for me. In my early 20s, I was in a kind of a one-way street due to the unresolved grief of losing my father at the age of 10. And neither my culture nor my family was really able to deal in a helpful way with that. I hadn't dealt with the grief, and it sparked a quest on my own. And by some good fortune, I stumbled upon the works of Carl Jung, who gave me clues on how to understand my dreams, how to see life in a different way. It's kind of given a certain glasses or perspective, in which you can see synchronicities and ways of thinking about the world. And that has been deeply meaningful. My life changed for the better, became passionate and purposeful again and meaningful. And it doesn't exclude suffering, but it added a lot of color to my life. So I'm deeply grateful to Jung and the world of dream for its help and guidance. Later on, I became a therapist, and I work mainly in that way. Then my comments on individuation. Jung means, as I see it, Jung means with individuation, the process of psychological growth. And with that, we had a beautiful statement somewhere where he says, the privilege of a lifetime is to become who you truly are. And that suggests a couple of things. First of all, that you come into the world with a certain qualities, with a certain talents, challenges, and struggles. And just like another quote by Jung is that the acorn becomes an oak and the calf becomes a cow, the human becomes a human, and everyone is unique in that way. And the giving form to the creative force, the uniqueness that flows through the human, is what Jung refers to as the individuation process. Now, this uniqueness that we carry is something that sets us apart from the community we live in. However, individuation is not an egoistic process. It is really tending to something deeper in ourselves, the deep self, or the big self, the capital S, as Jung calls it. And that is an individual journey, but it's not egoistic. And in a good way, this individual journey actually is really important to the community as well. We all carry gifts and talents, and that we need to deliver to community. And so in our own journey, whether we're maybe trying to find a good recipe in our cook, or we make gardens, or we fix cars, or we're a writer, we carry talents for community. And so that is when a person becomes deeply themselves, they actually at the same time deliver a gift to the community they live in. And that is another aspect of this individuation process. It is a way of becoming oneself, and at the same time, it's a challenge to live in a community where people, where if you become too much just community, you're not yourself. Jung had an interesting, so it's not about becoming a well-adapted person to community. It is really about how to be yourself within that community. And Jung had another interesting statement where he somewhere says, show me a sane man and I will cure him. So it is allowing the own uniqueness to come out and not to become well-adapted. Of course, this begs the question then on how do you figure out who you are and what this self is. And usually people find that in two ways. That's either where their love is or where they're wounded. Those are two big doors into figuring out who they were. So my wound was deeply in the loss of my father, the inability to deal with death, with loss, and that actually was the doorway into my own deeper layers of myself, that you would call the collective unconscious.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you. Go ahead.
Oh, okay. And then another way along that wounded sense is that you quoted or made some statement somewhere where you said the gods have become diseases. Zeus used to rule Mount Olympus, but he has now become the headache in the solar plexus. So a lot of our symptoms, whether it's depression, anxiety, obsessions, fantasies, are actually very important. They are the gods. They are the archetypes that will give us an entrance into figuring out what is living inside of us. And so Jungian psychology separates itself, for example, in looking at a depression, not to immediately medicate the depression or cut it out, but ask the question, what is the function in a depression? What in me is slowing down? Sometimes that is because we're on the wrong path, and the psyche proactively tries to make sure you don't stroll too far away, whether it's in a job you don't like, or a relationship that is not suited, or sometimes there's an internal process that is incubating and will give birth to some new creativity. So Jungian psychology looks at these symptoms as portals towards individuation. Now, I can say much more about it, but let me just stop here with a bit of an overview.
Thank you. Do you already have a question for the panel, or would you like to ask it a little bit later?
I would love to ask it a little bit later.
Sounds good. All right. Now, last but not least is my friend George. I have learned so much about Jung from him. As I was telling him a few minutes ago, you know, he's not only steeped in Jung, but well marinated. So, George.
Hello, everyone. I guess good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever applies. Thank you, Shrinkat, for the opportunity to participate in this forum. I like what Skip said, finding the light. Oh man, I love that. There's poetry there. I think that's a good title, Shrinkat, for this for these forums.
Mm-hmm.
Why Jung? Wow. I wish I could be my future self and respond to this question. It's difficult to respond. I think any response to these type of questions, it implies some sort of evolution. You know, it cannot be constrained by time. So I guess any response I give now is probably there's like a pause. You still got to wait for the complete answer. But at a personal level, I think I was 19. I was I think a sophomore. I was an undergraduate. This was like 1981, and you know, I was going through an existential crisis, if you want to call it, and that's a good thing. I agree with Richard. I think subjectivity is where it's at. You know, I don't want to dismiss, you know, the social dimension. I don't want to dismiss any other aspect, any other conduit that comes towards and, you know, goes back and forth with regards to the ego. But my personal story is I was floating between two classes. You know, freshman year, sophomore year, you have those 3 hours between classes. And I found myself in the science library, and I bumped into a shelf, and a book fell out. Two books fell out. One was Man and His Dream, Man and His Symbols, and the other one was the Homeric hymns. And I ended up reading those two, and I knew there was going to be ripple effects, you know, with these two. They were just strong forces, and I'm still surfing on those ripples. So, and I am looking for the light. You know, it's sometimes I think I do find, you know, I do experience it. I'm not sure we could localize it, say, you know, it's over there, but a lot of people do. But anyway, luckily I finished reading them, and the librarian told me, what are these books doing here? You know, they shouldn't even be in this library. You know, this was the science library. I guess they were supposed to be somewhere in the liberal arts section or social sciences. These were the physical science part. And so, I didn't know, but obviously I think there was a coincidence there, a meaningful coincidence. So historically, personally, that's where I think, I know that's where the threshold was for me historically. I stepped from here to there, and I think that's when I started exploring this transpersonal realm of existence. And subsequently, there were other similar critical episodes in my life. But why Jung? I think Jung, for me, provides a vocabulary with regards to why me? What am I? How am I? Okay, so that's enough for why Jung. Again, I'm 58 now. I hope in 58 years from now, I'll be able to readdress that question, why Jung? I also want to say Jung has propelled me to others. It's incredible, if you just his symbols alone, but his oeuvre, he introduces you to, alchemy, just to stay in general, the Gnostics. He introduces you to other depth psychologists. He compels you to develop an intimate relationships with the humanities. That's part of why Jung. It's not just his works, but he compels me, or maybe impels me, to both to examine other examinations of the human condition. He led me to the critical theorists. Anyway, that's part of my response to why Jung. With regards to individuation, I suppose unintentionally and intentionally, there's a correspondence between the noumenal and the phenomenal. I think Jung would place emphasis on the cultivation of the intentional correspondence between the noumenal and the phenomenal. Again, these are Platonic ideas and others. These are perennial ideas. Jung he doesn't have copyright to these motifs, these perennial questions, but he does articulate them quite well, at least for me. He has, and it's not only in terms of prose, but in terms of poetry, and I both resonate with me. Hence his incisiveness with regards to the human condition. And when I say human condition, I just don't mean the subjective, where that's what I'm mostly attracted to, but I think also how the subjective relates to the collective consciousness. So individuation is, I think, this ongoing stream of correspondence between ego and self, between subject and objective psyche. Yet, if I understand what others have said, we cannot dismiss the ego's relationship with collective consciousness vis-a-vis personae. That needs to be, Jung stressed that. People came to him, he did not dive into the unconscious. He wanted to hear their narrative first, the animistic analysis first. What's going on? Because if you're paranoid, there's possibility that other people are after you. But if that's not the case, well, then let's delve into, thank you, Skip. I see from your reaction that this may resonate. Then let's look at other forces that are other dynamisms. Consequently, shadow material and archetypal material, personal and impersonal material. But you need to maintain, you need to also have a strong, I would say a strong, well, not me, Jung, you need to have a strong ego. Subjectivity must have some sort of resiliency in order to, to operate personae. That's a lifetime's work right there. And then to have the boldness to encounter shadow material, that's another lifetime's work. And then to intentionally correspond with to transpersonal material, that's rare. That's rare. You got to be St. Paul. you got to be one of those guys. You got to be Saint Teresa of Avila. Anyway, that's my initial response to regarding White Jung and what's individuation. I think they're inextricable, and to develop a correspondence between this and that, I think is at minimum practically medicinal.
Wow. Wow. So this is amazing, amazing start. I mean, the thing is that Jung is so deep, and I think each five of you have put kind of different facets and different kind of it's just a range of his thought and range of issues on the table. This is great. So now is the time for panelists to ask other panelists questions. Now, Richard has jumped the gun, and thank you, Richard. So you get the first shot, but all four of you will have a chance to ask the panel one question. Okay. So Richard, go ahead and restate your question.
Yeah, let me try and make it clearer this time. Okay, so the thing is, personality, typology, sort of describing how we become one-sided and polarized, and our personality becomes potentially different to another person of a different type, for instance. Now, if you look at the psychological study of personality, it's part of individual differences, right? So there's something individual about personality, like by definition, most of psychology would agree. And then if you look at what Jung meant when he talks about individual and collective, sort of individuation, becoming an individual, becoming your individual self, from a state of what he'd call like collective being this, what is common to all of us, something that is not individual, ultimately. So in his, having read in Jung that it kind of goes that way, like individuation is the kind of the direction of the journey, and being a type to some degree is collective. You go to become individual from being collective. But then from the way I just described it, from psychology's definition, you could almost see it the other way around. That we be kind of, by transcending the opposites, which make us an individual in personality terms, I'd say we become more collective, we become more similar to back towards the integrated self. So I struggle with this. How do you see this? Like, which way around do you see it? Is individuation the individual, but the type is being collective, or in personality terms, is it completely the other way around? Or am I just confusing things?
Folks on the panel, you can just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak, and just go back and forth.
Okay, I have a question for you. It comes from the 1970s version of the Thomas Crown Affair, in which Steve McQueen and Faye Dunaway play the acting roles. And of course, in the Thomas Crown Affair, Thomas Crown has everything he wants, but he's in the process of wrapping up his life to go do something else. And at some point, Faye Dunaway asks Thomas Crown the question, what do you have to worry about? And his answer is, who I'm going to be tomorrow. And the movie wraps up with Thomas Crown robbing another bank, putting the money in a graveyard, in a trash can, leaving a note for Faye, and she arrives with the police. And the note reads, bring the money or keep the car. And the point was, either you go back to your rigid life of being an insurance investigator, or you come with me and realize the future of our lives together. And so the question then is, what do you have to worry about? I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Let's do one thing. Let's go ahead and take Skip's question first. You can respond to Skip's question first. Once we're done with that, we'll respond to Richard's question, and then rest of the panel can ask one by one. questions, but it will be difficult for people to hold too many questions in their heads. So let's start with Skip's question. So panel, anybody who wants to take a stab? You can just go ahead and unmute yourself and speak. You don't need to raise your hand or anything like that for the panel. Okay, and just one last thing. All the other, everybody except the panel, please keep yourself muted during this section. You will have a chance to ask questions. You can go ahead and keep asking your questions in chat, and I'm lining everybody up in chat. So once panel finishes asking questions to each other, then we will go ahead and open it up. Okay, George, go ahead. And let's keep the questions and answers short so we can get to as many people as we possibly can. George, go ahead.
I guess I'll go first because I went last, previously.
Go ahead.
Oh, by the way, my question, you never asked me, what's my question?
Yes.
My question is, it's a basic Jung question. What is evil?
Okay, very good. So go ahead. Would you like?
Yeah, if I understand Richard correctly, I guess, tell me if I'm correctly. I just want to make sure I understand it correctly. How does typology serve individuation?
Well, it's the way around that Jung describes individuation as becoming more individual and therefore being a type as being collective. But if you take a modern psychological definition, being a type is individual and actually becoming more transcended and would make you more similar to other people and therefore more collective. It's like I struggle to see it the way around that Jung described it, but I kind of get where he's coming from.
I don't get where he's coming from. I think he, individuation, again, he prefaced all his comments, and he contradicts himself all the time. And I wonder if he does that intensely, but I think you need to approach it, and I'm not copping now, I'm sincere when I say this, from a paradoxical perspective. And that, by definition, is a conundrum. It's a riddle. It's existential. If you're looking for some sort of reductive, conclusive response, you ain't gonna get it from me. But you need to approach, I think, paradoxical, and I think the process of individuation is simultaneously, whatever that is, from one individual to another individual, given conditions, is to animate individuality, simultaneously maintaining some sort of apathy with empathic approach towards collective consciousness. So and breathing the fumes of the unconscious. I know I copped out, but I think it's a paradoxical response. With regards to typology, I think it's a good damn place to start. Again, typology presupposes that you're doing egoic work, and by doing typology, by examining, your type and inferring the characteristics of that type, at one point you're gonna come and encounter the unconscious ego is gonna encounter the inferior function, and there you go, brother. Mm-hmm. You're entering the world of individuation. So, and that's gonna happen either intentionally. So you cultivate it with intent, with awareness. You're going to be bold enough to deal with that material, maybe the good or bad, and hopefully you're going to be able to integrate it into your existence, into your subjectivity, into your egoic functionings. And where that takes you, it's like a sail, man. You got to play with the wind. You got to negotiate that. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Let me go ahead. Let me add a couple of things.
I think
so. So Richard, this is a very unusual situation where I have something to say on Jung, because I have studied Jung, the John Beebe model very much, and I think that kind of provides a kind of an answer to it, because it combines both the concept of archetypes and the psychological functions together. Because what it says is that each person has these archetypes, but they are operating in a slightly different way, depending on what your individual psychological functions, strengths are. And I have always found, I echo what you said about this. I think Jung's understanding of psychological functions is far deeper than what is there in kind of classic, typical MBTI stuff going on. And I think people like BB have brought it together, both kind of, they have tried to leverage kind of these general patterns and try to integrate how kind of individual functions work with it. Does anybody else want to add anything on psychological function? Richard, I would love to do a full meetup on just that topic, on psychological functions and archetypes and that. So because that's a topic of perennial interest, we have come to it many, many, many times in our meetup over the last 3.5 years. So I would love to do that.
I'd like to just say, this is Randy Goldberg, I'm a Jungian astrologer, and that not to over focus on the typologies and that.
Randy, let's do one thing. We will open it up for everybody. Just hold on. Right now it is only in the panel.
Okay, my name's in the panel there.
Randy?
I run the DC Jungian meetup group.
Oh, Randy. Okay, go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, so, and the main thing that Jung didn't really want the Myers-Briggs sort of to be developed, and where typologies was over-applied and over-concretized. And so, and individuation, just simplistically is like Shakespeare's quote of be true to yourself. And so it's really about becoming who you are and living your own unique journey. So that's just what I wanted to say about that.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you, Randy. Anybody else, and anybody from the panel wants to raise another question? George, how about your question?
Well, I just wanted, I didn't have a chance to submit my closing comments regarding to Richard's question.
Go ahead.
It had to do with what Randy says. Just as a caveat, I think one of the risks, that's why I think facilitator is so important. But one of the risks with typology is that you get addicted to typology. I think that's what maybe what Randy's speaking to. I infer that and that's like anything else. If you become addicted to typology, the ego will only be encountered with the inferior function through projection. So that's unintentional, and that I would say is not hygienic, at least as a psychic point of view. So I think that's one of the risks of typology, and that's been my experience with a lot of folks who love these Myers-Briggs phenomenon, but they get too zealous with regards to their typology, and that's what Jung calls one-directional, and I think that's a warning for me. Be careful with that. So
all right. Let's go with George's question. Your question was, what is evil? Is that correct, George?
Yes.
Okay. Does Paul or Richard or Mikkel, anybody wants to add anything on that? What is evil?
This is Paul. First of all, I'm going to be evil and disregard your direction because I wanted to make a comment on Richard, on Richard's question, which was about this issue of the individual psyche versus the group psyche. I think is one aspect of that. And I want to relate it to what somebody mentioned in the panel, on the side panel here, about whether somebody is born with no culture at all, like the wild child, would they then just be pure individuation? Well, the research on that is no. People who are born and raised without human society are, as far as we know, deeply stunted and disturbed. They're very psychologically unhealthy and dysfunctional. So as far as I can see, there's a deep interplay between the group psyche and the individual psyche that are almost that are extremely difficult to tease apart, which is, I think, part of what Richard is struggling with, is how do you tease apart the group from the individual formats or models of psychology. And I would say you really can't. It's like separating neurology from psychology. They're deeply embedded in each other. And so that there's the part of the paradox that George was talking about, that paradoxical approach where we can think of ourselves as individuals, and in some ways we are, and in other ways we're not. and so we'll always be struggling with that that separation, wanting that separation, not wanting that separation at a different level, wanting to be free from the herd, but also wanting to be safe in the herd, and not being able to completely separate those elements of the psyche. Yeah, which is why my question is, Jung said that you can never fully individuate before you die. So my question is, was he right?
All right, folks, this is so wonderful. Thank you, Paul, for disregarding my instructions. The way you took it was better. I think I have tremendous trust in all of you gentlemen. So you can go back and forth and respond to whatever whatever think it will produce the most interesting and rich conversation over here for the audience. Yes, go ahead.
Well, I'd like to add about whether you can fully individuate before you die. The individuation is a process which simply never ends before you die, but it doesn't have an ending. And in response to the question, what is evil, I would offer Gertrude Stein's comment, which is, there ain't no answer. There never has been any answer. There ain't going to be no answer. That's the answer. And so in terms of what is evil, evil depends on the situation and the terrain. That's an old Marine Corps training approach, but you know, what you're going to do with your life in any given situation depends on where you are, what's happening, and what needs to be done. And then it's up to you, and you have to make the right choice. And so Dr. Jung always pointed back to 1 John 4:1, which is, examine the spirits, whether they be of God. I'll just leave it at that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. And he used evil also to enlarge kind of the Christian sense of, he wanted to point to how Jung said anything that is of human is within me, and that these things are relate to our journey, which of course is going not towards perfection, which is often a mistake that gets lost kind of in the, you can say, the Eastern model of development. I'm going to become enlightened. That's like a perfect state, where he's using the model of wholeness. So we're always becoming greater, more broad, and less one-sided, and not addicted to an ideology.
Okay, anybody else wants to pick up on any of the questions, or
yeah, I would be happy to respond to Muse on some of these things. A great question about the individuation process, and I also think it's because it presupposes this journey, that your journey, the end goal of the goal of life, you said somewhere, is death. In a certain way, death is the goal, and so the journey isn't over until you die. Then, if you take some other of Jung's work, where it becomes a bit more spiritual, he thinks that even after you die, your journey isn't really over. That you continue to have questions that pertain to your particular life journey. And Jung himself reports that he was visited by the dead, who had questions that were unfulfilled in his life, and actually that sparked his own individuation, because the questions that the dead had were the questions that were relevant to his life. So the journey is not only not over in this life, but also not even in a life after this life, if there is such a thing. So that is one. The other is to this typology, and I think that the typology is of course a man-made system. It doesn't truly exist. It exists because we created it, and as such, you just have a subset of clusters that you identify as a type, and each one of us has actually all these types within them, by which they have a preference for one or the other. But they can even shift a little bit. I can be an extrovert in certain activities in my life, an introvert in another. I can be thinking here and a bit more intuition there. So they shift. And just like, for example, heartbreak is both deeply personal as at the same time deeply collective. We all go through heartbreak when we lose a loved one. And the more personal we become in our own heartbreak, actually the more collective it becomes, because there it becomes an experience we all have that has more or less the same features. But we bring our own individual response to this, to our particular heartbreak. So in a strange way, there the collective and the individual merge on such a moment. And with the types, it is a person is something, and they express what they are in their individual life, their individual life circumstances, in a particular way that fits them best. And there it is where a life can be deeply personal, but yet have very deeply collective features at the same time.
Okay, folks, if you want to quickly respond to anything else, we can do that. There are more than 10 questions that the audience has, and I recommend getting to the questions very quickly, very soon. So if you want to go ahead and respond to anything within a minute or so, please go ahead. George.
30 seconds, hopefully. Just to respond to what Paul said, because I find it fascinating, if I may, and I guess it could be a subject for another time. But I believe what Paul was alluding to is what Jung proposed, participation mystique, this lack of differentiation between subject and objective psyche, not only at the individual, but also at the sociological level. And again, I think right there, he's actually alluding to the birth of the ego. So without culture, there is no nourishment of the ego. I think these are provocative questions. That for me excites me. So I think it speaks to the invaluableness to culture. The individual needs culture in order to scaffold the evolution of the ego. Without that, the evolution of the ego is arrested and one dies. So I think it's a fascinating, provocative question, and I don't know if that's what you would do, Paul, but I think the birth of the ego. As I understand Jung, when he talks about participation mystique, is when the ego has not yet, it's still a symbiotic, and development theorists say the same thing, but they employ a different lexicon, with regards to, Piaget agrees with it, however, he has a different vocabulary. But how does the ego develop? And without culture, I don't think so.
All right, folks, the audience is just bursting with questions. I have more than a dozen now. So let's start with the questions. So, so here are the rules for the questions. Please be very brief. I'm going to come to you in order. When I call upon you, unmute yourself, ask a question, keep the question as brief as possible, and unmute yourself. There are no follow-ups. Let's try to keep the answers also brief, because by the time we're done, there will be another dozen questions ready. Okay, so let's do that. So the first question is from Roger. Roger, go ahead. So give me just a second. Let me give you the order first. It's going to be Roger, then Steve, then Varun, then Randy, then Isidel, Ron W, Jean Jung, Zach, David, Julian, and Bet. Go ahead, Roger.
So just wanted to get a general, your thoughts on why should people try to do this? Why consider pursuing the conscious pursuit of individuation, especially when it seems to cost at such a high cost for the individual? And, the first integration is integrating your shadow, which requires you have to look at all the parts of you that you literally are avoiding. The second is, the contra-sex, and then finally the self, which is, as George said, pretty much almost unattainable. But why bother in the pursuit at all?
Let me offer a really quick answer. Jung, first, the answer is you don't have to. Nobody needs to, and most people don't. And what Jung said was that you're really, some people are driven to, And it usually takes a crisis, a serious crisis in life where how I have lived my life, how I have dealt with myself and other people is not working. It collapses, and it forces the person to go in a different direction, to go in a and for some people that means going in a deeper direction and going inside and finding out what they really want, what they're really driven by, and change the whole direction of their life. But no, you don't have to.
I would love to respond to that as well, because it's such a crucial question. And I think that the upside or the benefit is if you walk that journey, you get a sense of meaning, a sense of purpose, and that generates sometimes in a form of happiness. But even if it's not happy, you still feel that you're connected to something larger than yourself, that your life has meaning and purpose. And that makes life worthwhile, more colorful, and you can endure the difficulties that life has that life will put on our path.
Okay, the next question is from Steve. Steve, go ahead. Steve Sharper, are you there? Okay, I can't hear Steve. So the next question is from Varun. Varun, go ahead.
Hi, yeah, so my question was, like, I think already some panel members touched upon it. So I was like wondering that individuation seems to imply that there is some true you, true self, which is hidden because you have like created a persona to conform to some social norms. So like what happens if a child is not really exposed to society? And like fundamentally, is there even a you without everyone else?
Okay, anybody on the panel wants to respond? You can go ahead and just, panelist, if you want to just respond, just go ahead and unmute yourself and respond.
Yeah, I just first want to address some assumptions there, particularly with regard to the term true self. I hope we're not approaching this question that there's going to be some sort of universal response. I think the true self, I think we need to emphasize that the true self is always an idiosyncratic revelation, you know, and it's at best descriptive. You cannot define it. So we got to be careful with what true self alludes to and implies, not only explicitly but implicitly. You know, we need to unpack that. I think ultimately it's a subjective imperative, if that makes any sense. I know but we got to be careful not to again, I'm not dismissing the possibility of some sort of objective attributes, you know, being generous. You know, I think it's objective and subjective, but ultimately it is a moral choice. The subjective needs to decide: am I going to be generous or am I not going to be generous? How am I being generous? So, and I think it's connected with the previous question. Why on this pursuit? I think if you intentionally try to develop a relationship with one's true self, I think there's going to be meaning. I think significance will emerge. And if you don't do it, what I call unintentionally, and you follow some sort of cultural algorithm, it seems to me, I would claim that at one point you're going to have existential vacuity. You know, you're going to address questions like, why am I spending so much time in developing a career? Not that that's bad, there's utility there, but you're going to feel, I think, a lack of meaning in terms of what Mikhail said. So I think unintentionality lacks meaning. Intentionality will increase the probability that you will have meaning. So,
folks, I just want to say one thing. You know, these are very complex topics that we're talking about. And it is difficult to do full justice to them in quick answers. So, so the format that we have, but at the same time, you know, when you have 100 people on the line, we don't want to go on one question for a long period of time. We want to get as much interactivity as possible. So that's why the format we have designed the format that way, so that after this, we're going to break up into small groups. And that's where you can ask these questions and kind of get to bottom of these questions. And we're doing this as a series, so you can keep coming back. You know, don't lose any question that you have, because these are personally very important to you. And you can keep keep on track, week after week, in meeting after meeting, going forward. Okay, next person is going to be, give me just a second, is going to be Randy. Randy, go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment to Roger's question that, of course, nobody has to engage in Jung, but if they're interested in relationships, then they're going to delve into that material of the contrasexual other. And if they have a spiritual other, they'll try to understand what the self is. And Jung says that the real spiritual journey in the second half of life is about shadow work, is about admitting where you're fooling yourself and where you're hiding and where you're not being true to what's really happening. So that's just my response to that.
Okay.
Go to the next person.
All right. Next is going to be Isidel. Isidel, go ahead.
Hi, my name is Ellen. My question is the process of individuation like a journey of me exploring the fractal of myself? And those that aren't as familiar with fractals, is basically they're very similar, the big picture, versus when you drill into, the discrete components, you end up with a similar pattern. And so it's kind of never ending, but yet I think highly fulfilling, at least I would think so. So that's my question.
Anybody wants to take the question? Okay, we don't have a quick answer to that. You can ask that in these small groups again. Ron,
I'll give a one-sentence answer to that, of a comment on it. It's maybe not only the reflection on the fractal, but it has also to do with the expression of the fractal. So just insight alone is not enough. It comes with an ethical obligation to do something with it, and that's a really important addition to this concept.
And I would say yes to the extent that you see patterns in your life and they have meanings and that helps you track, and they can be in big things, they can be in the small things. So yes to that extent.
Next question is from Ron W. Go ahead, Ron. Ron? Okay. Next question is from Jean Jung. Jean Jung, go ahead.
Hi, thanks for the panel. So Freud and Jung had different perspectives on dreams. Freud believed that it was material coming up in a masked way to get past the repressive ego. And Jung believed it was not any type of hidden, whatever. He said it was a symbology that was open to your understanding. And he was also very much, he also said that the more you become aware of these archetypes, the more you can individuate. And I wondered what your perspective on that was. Why would that be?
Well, that's a huge question that you have there with so many different layers. But Jung's idea is that individuation is that we are born with a certain set of archetypes, and perhaps beneath it there's more archetypes that form the collective unconscious. And so if you become aware of your own archetypes, then you can give expression to what that is. And maybe you have the archetype of the painter in you, or of a cook, or a researcher, or a mathematician. And so once you know what lives in you, you can give expression to it. And that is what individuation is about.
Okay, next question is from Zach. Zach, go ahead. Zach, you're on mute.
Yeah, George. So George, you said something about how people can become kind of addicted to typology and different psychological types. And that resonated with me. That's definitely something I've felt in the past. Could you talk a little bit more about why that happens, and maybe the downfalls, or what we could do about kind of combating that? Or anybody on the panel for that matter.
Yeah, anybody. I'll take an initial stab at it, but anybody, if I miss anything, plug it in, man. Help me out. I hope I wasn't too judgmental. I hope my tone wasn't too judgmental when I said that. I know the Brooklyn in me gets a little zealous. Yeah, I think typology is a good place to start. I think anywhere you start is a risk. I think whatever ignites your awakening, follow it, man. Trust your intuition. But and it could start with what was said earlier. You know, you could start doing that. You know, by doing dream analysis. And I always say Jungian analysis. There's a wider scope with regards to the approach to psyche. But typology is a good way to begin to initiate, to generate a relationship with psyche. And practically, that's where it starts. Any depth psychologist, any particularly Jungian, would say you got to start with the ego, you know, and what that implies. And typology is a good place to start. I think what happens, we get addicted to it. And again, I use that as a broad term, also probably unconsciously as a cop-out. But I think if you, for example, if you're too much of a thinker, you know, there's going to be a preponderance of episodes in your life that you're going to try to relate to phenomena with a rationalistic lens. And there's nothing wrong with that. You know, you're going to try to categorize it. It's this, it's that, it's good, it's bad, it's tall, it's small, it's acceptable, it's non-acceptable. And that's a good approach. But it will always be incomplete. I think you're going to feel some degree of anxiety, of intense neurosis. And that's going to be expressed in a diversity of manner. I think once the thinker begins to correspond with the feeler, I think your relationship with phenomena will be much more richer. These are claims I entertain and I live by. I'm not asking you to live by them, but I will strongly urge you to entertain them. I think once the thinker becomes much more of a feeler, and so forth, or vice versa, once the feeler becomes much more of a thinker, I think you're going to have a much more integral, comprehensive, hygienic approach to phenomenon, either to ideas or to other people or to other lands. Any expression of the phenomenal, I think it's going to be much more richer if you approach it with an integral ego, and that implies the integration of one's inferior function and subsequent encounters. If that makes sense. And there's a tendency when you're a cultural individual, particularly since the Enlightenment, according to according to Jung, and I agree with him and others, there has been a tendency, as an example, to be addicted to rationalism, and that has been problematic, and that has ignited many of the symptoms that we're experiencing now.
Richard.
Yeah, I mean, I could talk all day on typology. It'd be really interesting to do a session on it specifically, and I can see
yes, sir, Richard, we are going to get you in for a whole day to talk about psychology, because there is a whole bunch of people here who would love to do that. Okay, go ahead. Go ahead, Richard.
I do think some people would be surprised in the way I even answer the question, what is typology? What is a type? You know, and you know, Jung talks about, you know, it's a framework, in his words, to make sense of the welter of empirical material that came up in his work. You know, he wanted to basically have a way of defining different broad domains of mental processing, which can be conscious or unconscious, and then that's what the type is, that we one-sidedly develop consciousness in one of these aspects of mental processing, and other ones as a consequence become unconscious and often more problematic for us. So I mean, the addiction this man was talking to, you know, about typology, I mean, it's the addiction of hunger for self-understanding. You know, I think that's a natural thing. And whatever way you find that, you know, whether it's typology or another way, that's a completely natural thing. You're going to have to find it. We're born to ask these questions. And I don't think it's a bad thing at all. But it's only bad in a sense if you only just fix on one narrow way of looking at typology or even any way of understanding yourself. You've got to cross over multiple models. The typology, just to add one last point, is that, you know, I see the individuation as, you know, the reconciliation of opposites, the integration of opposites. And you know, Jung talks about, like, the typological opposites are just one set of opposites that you can reconcile. He talks about attitudes, other kinds of attitudes that are not typological attitudes that you also have to work to reconcile and transcend. So, you know, typology is just one aspect of individuation. In a sense, there's other opposites.
Excellent. Next up is David. David, go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much. I wanted to react to George's question about is there evil? Because it's my approach.
Let's ask only questions. David, let's ask only questions. Go ahead.
I just wanted to say, apparently Jung's shadow is that repressed evil that's within ourselves that we manage to repress. We stay healthy and individuate. So, is evil something exterior like Satan, or is it interior?
Excellent. Anybody wants to take the question?
Well, that's again a question that could take up a whole day. First of all, the shadow is not only the dark side, but often can contain also positive elements. If a person has repressed their own talent for writing because they feel inferior and that they think I'm not a good writer, then writing could disappear into the shadow, and then it wouldn't necessarily be an evil element there. But it's like the frog prince in the story that needs to be integrated in order to become the prince. Jung thinks that the evil is part of the God image, and especially his answer to Job talks about evil and justice, and it's a good place to start reading about that. So Jung considers there's personal evil, collective evil, and it is part of the nature of the universe. Whether that's the case is a whole different aspect, but that's where Jung somewhat goes.
All right, now I do have something to say here. We are going to do an entire session. It won't be the whole day, but it's going to be at least 2 hours on shadow. And that's going to be this Thursday. We're going to, so that's the next one in this series. We're going to be talking about shadow. But in addition to that, my friend Roger is doing a presentation on Jordan Peterson's take on integration of shadow this Tuesday at 9 p.m. So Tuesday at 9 p.m. Eastern time is going to be Jordan Peterson's take on integration of the shadow. And then on Thursday, it is going to be Jung's take on shadow and how it relates to individuation. So that's what is coming up. All right, next question is from Julian. Julian, go ahead.
Hi, can you hear me? I'll be very quick. Earlier, I think it was Michelle who said type is something kind of man-made, or it's something that we collectively made. And I guess my question is, I'm one of those people who is close to typology to a point where I overanalyze it. How rigid or how objective do you think the structure of the, I guess, 4 sides of the mind, according to BB, or that sort of framework, once you know you've got a type here, does it really affect every other type within your framework? And should it not be focused on that much?
Richard, do you want to take that?
Sorry. While you're saying that, my wife was texting me saying, "Can you get the nappies out of the washing machine?" So I got slightly distracted. Domestic chores time, but yeah. If you talk, all right, I'll just try and get the gist of it. So you were talking about BB's model and other types within you. I mean, yeah, it depends on what way you use the word type, and there's multiple ways you could use it. But if you use type as in the 8 functions, as in different types of consciousness, like in BB's language, that's what the 8 function attitudes are. They're types of consciousness, and that's what Jung was describing. So I guess the point is by your psyche becoming orientated by one of those 8, then it puts you into a different qualitative relationship with the other 7. So it's just configuring your psyche so that one kind of takes the driving seat, so to speak. And that's, so it's just that in the sense that becoming a type, it puts you in a different relationship with the other types of consciousness. That's the way I'd look at it.
What, just really quick follow-up. So in a sense, is it objective or is it self-fulfilling? Like I've typed myself and my eagerness to self-define leads me into that framework and relationship with the other types.
You mind if I jump in with a quote here? part of the question is about, well, how objective, how real are the types? And do there have to be 4 of them, or are there more of them? And what that leads me to think is, well, as human beings, we create models about what is true. And to some extent, those models may or may not have validity. So they reflect in some way reality, but they're also always projections of the human imagination onto reality. So I want to quote Aldous Huxley. That's what the human brain is there for, to turn the chaos of given experience into a set of manageable symbols. Sometimes the symbols corresponded fairly closely to some aspects of the external world behind our experience. Then you have science and common sense.
Excellent. Next question is from Françoise. Françoise, go ahead.
Could I respond to that a little bit really quickly?
Sure, go ahead, George.
Yeah. Oh man. I think you can start anywhere. I think Jung's typology is a really good place to start. And I think it's a matter of, when you say ego personality or ego consciousness, what does that imply? For me, that implies orientation. Now, I think Jung's work does provide some sort of compass for one to navigate one's journey on the ocean, and that journey can be quite, it's populated with storms. So to have some sort of compass, to have some sort of orientation, typology can facilitate, not guarantee success, but can facilitate that journey, if that makes any sense, poetically.
Okay, next one is Françoise. Françoise,
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Hi, my question is about finding the light. We mentioned that that situation of finding the light, and I was wondering if that's frequent and if that's bring you to completion. And if you could give some specific example where you found the light and you had the feeling of completion.
Françoise, the best metaphor for this is from The Sound of Music, where the Mother Superior says, when God shuts a door, he opens a window. And so the point is that a lot of things relate to trauma. And when you have trauma, you also have a light that appears, something which will guide you. Okay, as Holderman says, when things are blackest, that's when the light appears. And so finding the light has to do with finding the next path that you're going to follow in your individuation process. So in my case, I thought I was going to become a general in the Marine Corps until I broke my leg. So that was a pretty dark moment. And I have an artificial ankle as a result of that. But I found something else to do. In fact, something else's to do since then. And so you just have to find the next thing. It doesn't mean that you're going to go back to doing whatever it was you were doing. You may be stopped by that. But when God shuts a door, he opens a window. That's finding the light.
Is that Bollinger in the background?
Sorry?
Skip.
Yes. I was on my iPad, but my wife finished her Buddhist session so I could come back to my computer.
All right, folks. So this has been fantastic. We've been at it for almost, how much is it? 1 hour, 40 minutes. So what we're going to do now is I'll give time for people to make kind of quick closing statements if they want, each of them, maybe 2 minutes or so. And I want to tell you about what's coming up. This is an entire series of 9 events, and the format will be the same. It will be a panel discussion of different panelists who have deep experience with Jung coming and talking about concepts. So the next one is going to be shadow this Thursday. Then it's going to be, don't know what's the next one. There is going to be archetypes, persona, conscious, personal, personal unconscious. We're going to go through everything, you know, all the key concepts, which are kind of summarized in the diagram that I have on the Meetup page. And that is coming up. So every Thursday night at 9 p.m. Eastern time, and every Sunday night at 2:30 p.m. Eastern time. So after these closing statements, what we are going to do is that we are going to do breakout rooms where people can gather in groups of about 5 to 6 people, and you can talk about these ideas in great amount of detail. And we are going to do 2 series of breakout rooms. So first one will be for 20 minutes. And the second one, then we'll bring everybody back into, you know, and divide them into another combination. So you get to talk to multiple, you know, different people. And then in the second room, you can spend as much time or as little time as you want. And, you know, panelists, you're welcome to leave, you know, when we do the breakout rooms. You're not obligated to stay in the breakout rooms, but you are, you know, of course, very welcome to stay on. So we can go ahead and make the closing statements in the opposite order this time. So George, you go first.
Again, thank you, Stray Cat. Thank you, everyone else, for this opportunity to participate. I guess I'm going to use Jung's and I think Hillman, others as well, but those are the first 2 that pop up. And some of you already cited it. The biblical story of the acorn. I think it's located in Sermon of the Mount. I agree with that metaphor. I think I entertain that metaphor that we all have this potential for this broader personality, which includes personal and transpersonal aspects, and how you constellate those aspects, given your existential journey, I think can be glorious, particularly if it's done with intent. And it seems to me the analytical psychology provides you with a map that can facilitate that intention. That's it.
Okay, next one up is Mikhail.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks all to the panelists and the participants. And maybe a final thought is that individuation is an ongoing process of calling. Big callings in one's life and little callings. And the callings are there every day in synchronicity, in dreams, in whatever you encounter in life is a little invitation of the larger self or universe to more deeply participate with the creation of life. And so everything can be an opportunity to enter more deeply into life, which will manifest as a deeper sense of meaning and purpose. So I wish you all a more rich and colorful life.
Wonderful. Skip, you're next.
I'm sorry, I was focusing on some chat questions. So I'm sorry, what am I doing now?
Just closing, 2-minute closing statement. What do you want people to leave with?
Remember the acorn. It knows how to become an oak.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Next one is Richard.
It's a closing comment just to think about that point of do we ever fully individuate? Like, can we become that the subject is this thing that holds the center point of everything, and there is no conflict and there are no opposites? Maybe people experience that fleetingly through like meditation and other things, but do we ever permanently enter that state? I don't know.
Wonderful. It's Paul now. Paul, go ahead.
You know, so there's a lot here about becoming more of oneself and finding that deeper sense of who one is, different aspects of oneself, and challenging my own preconceptions of myself and seeing if I can widen that and deepen that. And I can't help but reflect on what we're all dealing with in terms of a pandemic, and how in my own life this is changing part of aspects of how I see myself and how I see myself in the wider world. As I spend enormous amounts of time with my wife and my children, and doing work in a different way, and through this, I find myself connecting with the outer world and widening my sense of self in the outer world in different ways than I have before. So in a bizarre way, I feel like what's happening around us right now can be part of an individuation process as well as a collective psyche process.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Paul. All right.